I was kidnapped and auctioned off as a virgin. That same night, a Mafia boss paid millions for me in front of men who looked at me like merchandise. I should have hated him. I should have feared Cassiel Renvoy the way I feared every man in that gilded hall. But he didn't touch me. He just opened the car door, tossed his overcoat within my reach, and promised I would sleep alone. The problem is that men like him never save someone for free. I agreed to step into his house knowing that freedom could come with a price too. And when Cassiel came to collect, maybe my body wouldn't be the most dangerous part of the debt. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. The Night They Broke Down the Door. The store smelled of new fabric and cold tea forgotten on the counter. I was folding the last stack of blouses when the lady in the beige coat came back for the third time, holding a wine-colored dress up against her body and quietly asking if I couldn't give her a little discount. I smiled, because that was what I did best, and I keyed into the system a price that was going to earn me a scolding on Monday. She squeezed my hand across the counter and walked out happy, and I stood there staring at the glass door, with Chicago lighting up in neon on the other side. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket. It was my mother. Leora, sweetie, did you remember your medicine? I remembered, Mom. I'm heading home. Did you have your tea? I did. Did Theo stop by? I swallowed the answer, because the truth was that Theo hadn't stopped by anywhere in weeks. I only said he must be working, and she believed me, because she always believed whatever I told her about my brother, and I felt like a silent accomplice to his lie. I hung up and looked at the screen. An old message, still unanswered. Theo, call me. Lower down. Another one from 2 days ago. Theo, please. I put the phone away. I closed up the shop with the care of someone closing a little music box. I turned off the lights one by one, double-checked the lock, pulled my coat tight around me. The October wind came straight at me, slicing down Wabash, and I tucked my chin into my collar and walked fast. The puddles reflected red from the traffic light, then green, then red again, and I thought it was strange how a wet street looked prettier than a dry one. At home, my mother was already asleep. I heated up some soup, ate standing in the kitchen, and carried the bowl to the little table in the living room, because that was where my father's book was. It was an old volume with a worn blue cover, about the sea off Sicily. He had read that book to me so many times that I knew the smell of the pages by heart. I opened to some page at random, ate slowly, and read about a white chapel by the sea with an old bell. I fell asleep with the kitchen light still on. It was the glass that woke me. The sound came first from far away, as if I were dreaming, and then very close, with the shrill of something shattering against the floor. I sat up on the couch in the dark, not knowing what my hand was supposed to brace against. There was a second scream from my mother's room, and then the front door gave way with a dry crash. 2 men walked in, hooded, black from head to toe. They weren't tall. They were heavy. One of them spotted me before I could even scream. This one. That was it. This one. Like someone pointing at a piece of fruit at the market. Theo! I shouted, and the name came out before I understood why it was that one, as if some part of me already knew who to hold accountable. Theo. My brother appeared in the hallway doorway, barefoot, with the wide eyes of someone who understands before his mouth does. He stood there, frozen like a badly made statue, his hand on the doorknob and his mouth open, and I remember thinking, in some cold corner of my head, that he was paralyzed because he knew what was happening. I didn't. Theo, do something. A gloved hand grabbed the back of my neck. Another yanked my arm so hard something popped in my shoulder. I thrashed, kicked, bit into fabric. I tasted dust. The second man caught my legs the way you'd tie up a sack. Leora! Theo finally shouted, and he ran 3 steps. But the man only had to stretch out an arm to shove him against the wall. Leora, I swear. He didn't finish what he was swearing. A thick cloth covered my head. The world turned into black cotton and the smell of oil. They hauled me out, and I heard the building's front door slam, and the biting October wind hit my bare shin because I was in pajamas. The car reeked of old leather and stale cigarettes. They threw me into the back seat like I was a coat. The door slammed. The engine started. I tried to remember the route by the turns, but I was crying inside the cloth, and every turn scrambled what little I tried to hold on to. The 2 of them were talking low in the front seat. The kid's trash. How much was he in for again? I don't know the exact amount, but it's a kid's debt. The kid's debt with Sabino. Vasari doesn't forgive a kid. That's why the sister pays. I pressed both hands to my chest under the cloth. Sabino, Vasari, Sabino, Vasari, Theo, Theo, Theo. I kept repeating my brother's name in my head like someone repeating a prayer. And with every repetition, I saw more clearly what he had done, and with every repetition, I hated him less and understood him more. And that was the worst part. The car went down a ramp. I felt it through my ears. The sound changed, got muffled, like inside a garage. They stopped. They yanked me out of the seat with the same roughness they'd shoved me in with. We walked down a hallway. I knew it was a hallway from the echo of the footsteps. The cloth came off my head in one pull, and I blinked against a gold that hurt my eyes. It was a bedroom. No, it was a cage dressed up as a bedroom. The walls were painted a matte gold. An old crystal chandelier hung in the middle. A red rug that must have been pretty a decade ago. It smelled of perfume that was too sweet over something sour. A tall window, closed from the inside with a thin grate of ornamental metal. And there were 3 girls. The first one was sitting on the edge of a canopy bed, her bare feet on the rug, and her dark hair falling to her waist. She looked at me without moving. The second one, younger, in a corner, with her knees pulled up to her chest, was shaking so hard, her shoulder kept hitting the wall in a quick rhythm. The third was standing, leaning against the post of the canopy, and didn't really look at me. She observed me, which is a different thing. The door behind me was locked with a heavy key, the kind that takes a while to turn. "Sit down," said the one with the dark hair, in a voice hoarse from too little sleep. "Just sit before you fall." I didn't sit. I stood there in the middle of the room with my arms at my sides, my pajamas wrinkled, feeling my heart in my throat. "Where am I?" I started. "Veluto Nero," she answered, quietly, the way you say the name of a disease. "Nightclub? Basement?" She swallowed. "Sabino Vasari owns it." "I'm Pilar." "Inez," whispered the one in the corner, without lifting her head. The third only tilted her chin a millimeter. "Marisco," Pilar said for her. "She doesn't speak. She listens." I braced my hand on the canopy post so I wouldn't actually fall. Pilar noticed, and pulled me by the tips of my fingers to the edge of the bed, with a tenderness that didn't belong in that place. I sat down next to her. "What's your name?" she asked. "Leora. Leora." She repeated it as if testing a name in the dark. "How old?" 22. She let out a breath through her nose that could have been a laugh, if we had lived in a different world. "You're the old one in the room, then." She nodded toward Inez with her chin. 17. Me, 20, but with 40 years of living in this place. "Marisco, nobody knows. Are you a virgin?" The question came without warning, like the glass that had shattered at my door. I felt my face heat up before the answer could come out, and I didn't even need to open my mouth, because Pilar was already watching my silence. "You are," she answered for me. She closed her eyes for a second. "Then that's why." "Why what?" "Why this room?" She ran her hand over the gold on the wall. "This one's the good room, the gold one. The other girls stay in the basement under the basement. This is where Sabino keeps the auction piece." The word auction dropped into my chest like a stone into a well. I looked at Inez, who clenched her knees even tighter. I looked at Marisco, who looked back at me with the calm of someone who had already counted the steps in the hallway and memorized the guard shifts. "Auction," I repeated quietly, because my brain needed the word said out loud to believe it. "High bids. Men worse than these ones here." Pilar pointed at the door. "They clean you up, dress you, do your hair. They serve you tea with honey, and then they push you out into the hall. And then?" Pilar didn't answer right away. She looked at the old chandelier the way someone looks at the sky. "Then you go home with someone," she said. "And what happens in that house depends on the someone. Nobody comes back from here to tell another girl." I swallowed saliva I didn't have. I felt the soup from earlier rise to the middle of my chest and stop there. My fingers were shaking against my pajamas. I thought of my mother asleep, of the tea she would forget to drink in the morning. I thought of Theo, mouth open in the hallway doorway. I thought of the worn blue book, open on the little table in the living room, of the white chapel by the sea. "I am not," I murmured, more to myself than to Pilar. I saved it. I saved it because I was scared, not because..." The sentence had no ending. I looked at her. "Not this way. I saved it so I wouldn't be scared. And now I'm going to be scared either way." Pilar ran her thumb over the back of my hand, slowly. "Listen to me, Leora." Her voice dropped even lower. "Don't cry in front of them. If you cry, they pay more. You save the crying for when the door closes. When you're alone, you cry. In front of them, You turn to stone. You hear me. I nodded. I couldn't form a sentence. Inez started crying quietly in the corner, and Marisco crossed the room without a sound, sat down next to her and pressed her forehead against Inez's temple. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Pilar kept holding my hand. I looked at the chandelier, at the window grate, at the gilded door, at my bare feet on the red rug. I thought, in some strange place inside myself, that I didn't want to survive that first night. I thought it would be easier to fall asleep and not wake up. I thought of my mother and pushed the thought away immediately because it hurt more than the shoulder that had popped. I closed my eyes. I prayed. I didn't know if I was praying to a god, to my dead father, to the white chapel, to the old bell. I prayed to anything that would listen. I asked not to survive that first night, and then I asked forgiveness for having asked it, because my mother would be waiting for me the next morning with cold tea on the table, and I had no right to not come back. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were boot steps, in the hallway outside. They weren't hurried. They were methodical. 3 men, maybe 4, with short pauses between one stride and the next, like someone stopping in front of each door to check on something. Pilar squeezed my hand. "Leora," she whispered, in a voice that didn't even have the little bit of pretense it had before. "Look at me." I looked. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. A shadow darkened the gap underneath. There was a murmur, then a short laugh, then a lower voice saying a number I couldn't quite catch. "What is that?" I asked, my mouth dry. Pilar didn't take her eyes off mine. "They're choosing the order." Chapter 2. The Man in the Black Suit. 2 days inside the gilded room passed like a held breath. The shower was cold and quick, behind a fabric screen that covered nothing. Food came on small trays, always less than 4 women needed. I shared my portion with Inez, who kept shaking even when the sun came through the high slit in the window. Pilar ate slowly, chewing each bite like someone rationing her strength. Marisco sometimes refused, and nobody asked why. In those 2 days, I learned to count the footsteps in the hallway. The heavy ones were guards. The dragging ones were the women who served. The slow, thin-heeled ones were Vasari's own. And when those came, we'd stop breathing before the doorknob turned. "Don't cry," Pilar repeated for the 3rd time that afternoon. Her voice was still hoarse, like sand rolling down a pipe. "They like it when we cry. Swallow the water on the inside, girl. Make a lake, but don't let it overflow." Inez rested her forehead on my shoulder. I held her hand in both of mine. "Is today the day?" I asked, in a thread of a voice. Pilar looked at the high window. The light had changed color. Today. That was when the woman with the dead eyes walked in. She was carrying a dress in her arms the way you'd carry a slaughtered animal, the color of old champagne, with seams that glinted softly. She held it out to me without a word. Behind her, a second woman came in with a tray of makeup. "Put it on," said the first. It was the only word she seemed to know. My body obeyed before I could think. The fabric was cold against my skin and tight in all the wrong places. The woman's hands ran up my back, fastening what needed to be fastened, and at no point did they touch me as if I were a person. Pilar looked at the floor. Inez closed her eyes. Marisco kept watching, without blinking, recording something. When they were finished, the woman turned me toward an oval mirror leaning against the wall. I didn't recognize myself. The girl in the mirror had her hair pinned to one side, her mouth painted a dark red and bare shoulders. She looked older. She looked less mine. Pilar came up behind me, smoothed a fallen strand, and held my wrist for a second. "Look up, but don't look at anybody. Find a spot on the wall and stay on it." Her voice was a whisper glued to the back of my neck. "If someone lifts your chin, don't resist. Resisting costs." The door opened again. Sabino Vasari walked in unhurried, like someone visiting a shop window. Silk suit, too many rings on his fingers. The smile rehearsed to look like hospitality. He came up to me and lifted my chin with 2 fingers. I didn't resist. His cologne had something too sweet about it, like a flower that had started to rot. "You're going to make me more than this whole wing put together," he said, examining my face the way you'd check a diamond in the light. "Go up there and keep quiet. Your mother wants you alive. So do I." I didn't answer. I found the spot on the wall behind his shoulder, a thin crack in the gold wallpaper, and clung to it the way a drowning person clings to a board. "Remember the deal, sweetheart." His voice dropped. "You open your mouth about what you saw here, and your sick mother is going to need more than medicine. Understood?" I blinked once. That was all I could manage. He let go of my chin, satisfied, and gestured to the dead-eyed woman. Pilar held my hand before they pushed me into the hallway. "Lake," she whispered. "Make a lake." The door shut behind me with a click that felt final. The hallway was longer than I remembered. Red carpet, gilded walls, chandeliers hung too low that made the air feel heavy. 2 guards walked in front of me, 2 behind. I walked in the middle, barefoot inside my own shoes. I heard the music before I saw the hall, a piano in the back, playing something slow to pretend the night was a party. When the door opened, the light blinded me for a second. It was low, golden, with narrow spotlights falling on a small circular stage in the middle. Around it, round tables, glasses full of dark whiskey, and men, only men, 15, maybe 20, none of them with a whole face visible, some in shadow, some behind cigar smoke, some partially covered by small black fabric masks. I climbed the 3 steps onto the stage with the help of a guard's arm. I found a dark spot at the back of the hall, near the rear door, and locked my eyes on it. The auctioneer had a low, almost polite voice that paired terribly with what he was about to do. "Gentlemen, tonight we begin with the main piece. 22 years old, healthy, untouched." He paused elegantly. "Opening bid, 100,000. A man raised a finger. 150, said the auctioneer. Another finger, another voice. The numbers started climbing 50 by 50, then 100 by 100, then 200 at a time. I could hear my own breathing louder than the piano. The dark spot trembled inside my eyes, and I blinked fast to hold back the lake. "Don't cry, Leora, don't cry." 800,000, the auctioneer announced. The music stopped. 1 million, a finger at the first table. I heard ice clink at the bottom of a glass. 1.5 million, a finger in the third row. The auctioneer cracked a small smile. 2 million. "Gentlemen, any other offers?" And in that second, with the gavel already halfway up, the new voice entered the hall, low, unhurried, like someone commenting on the weather outside. 5. The whole hall turned. A glass hit a table louder than it should have. At another table, someone dropped a cigar onto the ashtray without finishing the drag. The piano didn't come back. For the first time that night, no one laughed or whispered. I turned too, because I couldn't not turn. He was standing, leaning against one of the columns near the entrance, and I had no way of knowing how long he had been there. Black suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open only at the first button, dark hair combed back with a calculated carelessness. On the little finger of his left hand, a ring, a dark, matte stone, catching the light from only one side. His eyes didn't look for any of the men at the tables. They came straight to me. They didn't travel down my body. They stopped on my face and stayed there. I forgot the crack at the back of the hall. 5 million, the auctioneer repeated, his voice involuntarily going up a notch. 5 million, gentlemen. Anyone going to top that? Silence. At the first table, the man with the ice in his glass opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. 5.5, he tried. The man in the black suit didn't look at him. 6, he said, in the same tone. 6.5, came a voice from another table, hoarse, with an accent I didn't recognize. 7, 7.5, 10. The word fell into the hall like a rock into a well. Glasses stilled. The piano didn't come back. From the corner of the stage, I saw Sabino Vasari leaning against a side wall, his fingers crimped around a glass, the rehearsed smile starting to fail at the corners of his mouth. 10 million, the auctioneer repeated, and his voice was no longer as polite. Anyone going to top 10 million? No one raised a finger. The man in the black suit set his eyes on the auctioneer for the first time. It was a half-second look. It was enough. "Sold," said the auctioneer, lowering the gavel in an almost contrite gesture. "To the gentleman by the column." The hall exhaled. It was an ugly sound. A collective sigh of men who had lost. I stood on the stage with no idea what to do with my hands. Vasari crossed the room before I could come down the steps. His smile had returned, but it was a reassembled smile, hastily stitched. He walked past me without looking at me, and went straight to the man in the black suit. "Renvoy," he said, opening his arms with a false cordiality that smelled like a rotting flower. "I hope you enjoy the acquisition. I had no idea you frequented my little evenings." "I don't," he answered, without looking at Vasari. "Tonight I had to. May I offer a cigar before the young lady is taken?" "No," that was all. Cassiel turned half a step toward the stage, and I understood it was for me. I came down the 3 steps. The guard in front of me stepped aside. Vasari tried to take my arm in one last theatrical gesture, and Cassiel slid his hand between the two of us without even looking at him. There was no touch, just Cassiel's arm in the way. Vasari pulled back half a centimeter, the smile still stitched. "This way," Cassiel said, low, to me. He didn't hold me. He rested his hand a short distance from my back, without touching, and the presence of that untouched hand gently nudged me toward the side door I had never seen anyone leave through. The hallway beyond that door was different, less gilded, cleaner, white lights. Behind us, I heard Vasari's voice climbing a note higher for the men in the hall, picking the night back up. The piano came back. I didn't come back. "And can you walk a little farther?" Cassiel asked, without turning his face. I nodded. He didn't see it, but he kept walking at my pace, and that told me something I didn't yet know how to name. We went down a narrow staircase. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, a steel door opened into an underground garage, lit by white bulbs and exposed iron on the ceiling. A long, black, armored car waited, engine silent. The man at the wheel I had already glimpsed in the hall. Tall, broad-shouldered, short hair, the face of someone who didn't joke around and didn't threaten for fun either. "Sandro," said Cassiel, and he opened the back door for me with the same calm he had used to bid 5 million. I got in. The seat was cold leather. The smell inside the car was discreet. Leather, some kind of wood, nothing sweet. Cassiel got in on the other side, closed the door carefully, and not once did he bring his body close to mine. He sat at the opposite corner, with a whole stretch of space between us, like someone respecting a frightened animal. The car rolled out up the ramp. I looked down at my own hands over the champagne-colored dress. They were shaking in a way I couldn't stop. The air conditioning hit my bare shoulders. Cassiel moved for a second. I froze. He noticed. He stopped midway through the gesture. Instead of continuing, he opened the overcoat that had been folded next to him and laid it across the seat, in the space between us, within reach of my hand. "It's for you," he said, in a low voice. "I'm not going to put it on you. You put it on if you want to." I looked at the overcoat. I looked at him. It was the first time, in 2 days, that anyone had given me a choice. I pulled the heavy fabric up over my shoulders, slowly. It smelled of something clean and warm, sandalwood maybe, but not sweet. I covered my arms, then my chest. The shaking eased by a millimeter. Cassiel looked out the window, not at me. "You're shaking," he said, slowly turning his face toward me. "Is it the cold, or me?" I opened my mouth, closed it. I looked for the crack on the wall in the hall inside my head, and this time it wasn't there. Instead, there was this man who had paid 10 million for me and hadn't touched me. I didn't answer. He accepted the silence without pressing. He kept looking out the window, and I saw, in the reflection on the glass, that his jaw was locked in a way the rest of his body didn't let show. The car left the city. The lights grew sparser. The pavement started rising and falling in wider curves, and the smell of the air changed. A breath of water came in, of something open, cold, vast. I pressed my temple against the cool glass. Outside, after a long curve, the road opened over a dark and silver expanse that stretched as far as the eye could see. Lake Michigan. It was the first time I had seen it like that, with no buildings around it, no fence, no sign, and at the tip of a strip of land that pushed out into the water, at the end of a long avenue of dark trees, a house appeared around the bend. Enormous, stone, dark windows, all of them, except one, a single light on the second floor, waiting. Cassiel saw what I was seeing. He didn't say anything, only, quietly, almost to himself, "You'll sleep tonight, alone, I promise." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 48 hours, inside the overcoat of a man I didn't know, with the yellow light of that house growing on the other side of the glass, I no longer knew if the fear I felt was the same fear as before, or a new fear of something I hadn't yet learned how to name. Chapter 3. A robe, soup, and a closed door. The iron gate opened without a sound. The armored car glided down a damp gravel drive, lined with trees that looked like they were keeping ancient secrets, and stopped in front of the pale stone staircase of the mansion. The single light on the second floor was still there, patient, as if it were waiting for exactly me. Cassiel got out first. He didn't offer his hand. He opened the door on my side and stepped back, leaving the space between us wide enough for me to get out without touching him. I grabbed the hem of the champagne-colored dress, which now felt heavier to me than the cold, and stepped down. The gravel crunched softly under my soles, and the damp smell of the lake came in a gust. Dark water, wet leaves, a hint of pine from far off. Sandra will stay at the entrance, Cassiel said, in a low voice, to someone I hadn't even noticed in the shadow. No one goes upstairs. The man nodded. I climbed the steps, counting them so I wouldn't have to think. 1, 2, 3. The front door opened before Cassiel touched it, drawn back by a woman in a gray apron, her hair pinned up, who looked at me and looked away with a kindness that hurt me more than if she had stared. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and some flower I couldn't name. High ceilings, a long hallway, discreet portraits on a wall where no face looked back at me. Cassiel walked slowly, like someone who knows he is leading someone who might break with the next step. We climbed an oak staircase. On the second floor, he stopped in front of a door. "This is your room," he said. "It's not mine." I looked at him, not understanding the importance of that sentence. Cassiel opened the door and stepped to the side. The room was large, with windows facing the lake. The bed was made, with white sheets and a sand-colored blanket. On the armchair, folded carefully, was a fluffy robe, pale, simple. Next to it, a tray with a covered bowl. The smell of soup rose like a hug I hadn't asked for. Sweet garlic, a hint of thyme, something warm that seemed to know my body better than I did that night. "And the maid left it," he explained, from the doorway. "It's hot. You can eat now or later." I stood in the middle of the room, hugging my own arms. He didn't come in. "Leora," said Cassiel. It was the first time he had said my name. It came slowly, as if he were testing the weight of each syllable before letting it go. I lifted my eyes. "I'll knock before I come in," he continued. "Always. If you don't answer, I don't come in. If the door is locked from the inside, even better. The bathroom is through that door. There's clean clothing in the top drawer of the dresser. If you need anything, there's a bell next to the bed. A woman will answer. No one else." I swallowed hard. I tried to say thank you, and the word wouldn't come out. It got stuck somewhere between my throat and my chest, the size of a stone. Cassiel seemed to understand. He tilted his head slightly, like someone accepting a silence in place of an answer. He left. The door closed with a discreet click. I heard the key turn on the other side and my heart almost stopped. But then I heard the same click in the other direction. He had locked and unlocked it on purpose, so I would know the key existed, and that it stayed with itself. I walked over to the door, pressed my forehead against it and breathed until I stopped shaking. The wood was cool against my skin, and I stayed there too long, counting the sound of his footsteps going down the stairs until they disappeared on the lower floor. I slept in my clothes, on top of the blanket, with my head against the doorknob. The soup went cold on the tray. I didn't have the courage to eat it. I woke up to the light off the lake coming through the window. For a second, I thought I was home, with the cracked ceiling of the apartment and the smell of my mother's medicine. Then I remembered. I sat up in bed slowly. The old tray was gone. Another, with coffee, fruit, and bread, had appeared on the little table. On top of the bread was a handwritten note, in firm letters. No flourishes. Eat. You don't have to thank me. I ate. Every warm sip went down, as if it were giving me back pieces of my body that had been left behind in the armored car. I took a shower. The hot water hit my shoulders and washed away a strange smell I hadn't noticed I was still carrying. The heavy perfume of the gilded room. Smoke. Somebody else's sweat. I put on the clothes that were in the drawer. Gray sweatpants. A white t-shirt. Thick socks. All my size. I didn't want to think about how he knew my size. In the afternoon, I worked up the courage. I opened the door carefully and followed the hallway. The house was enormous and silent. I found Cassiel in the downstairs living room, near the unlit fireplace, with a book open in his lap. He raised his eyes before I came in, as if he had heard me coming down. I started, and my voice wobbled. "Thank you, for the soup, and the note." He closed the book slowly and stood up, and took a step back. Not far, only enough that the distance between us stopped being intimate. I understood, and my chest tightened in a new way. "You don't have to thank me," Cassiel said. "It's already in the note." "It is," I whispered, but I wanted to say it. He looked at me for a long second. Something crossed his face that I couldn't read. He gave a small nod. Then he gestured with his chin to the black device on the side table. "She called 3 times, he said. "A woman. Said you'd recognize the name. Henna. I had Sandro let the store you worked at know that you were all right. She must have wrung this number out of him." The name of my best friend crossed the room like a breath from the real world. I ran to the phone before I could think. "Henna? Leora Hawthorne, you little wretch!" Her voice exploded on the other end, and I held the receiver away from my ear. "Are you alive? Where are you? Whose house are you in?" I laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh that slipped out before I could hold it back. The first one in weeks. Cassiel, from the other side of the room, slowly turned his face toward me and stopped, like someone who had heard a rare bird. "I'm fine," I said, low. "Henna, I swear I'm fine. I can't explain right now. You're in the house of a man who pays millions for one night, and you're telling me you're fine. Leora, I'm coming over. I'm coming with my aunt and her broom." "No," I said, laughing again, my eyes filling with water. "Don't come. I'll call you tomorrow. I promise." "Do you swear on your mother?" "I swear." I hung up and stayed with my hand on the phone, feeling the plastic warm slowly under my palm. Cassiel hadn't moved. He had the book closed against his leg and was watching me with a stillness that was almost a question. "Friend," he said. "That best friend. You can call whenever you want," he said. "This phone is yours while you're here. Marique, the consigliere of the house, will want to meet you when you're ready. No rush." I nodded. He didn't add anything else. He didn't ask me not to tell anyone where I was, didn't ask for any silence from me. I went back up to the room with that absence of demand hitting my chest like a soft blow. That night, the nightmare came. The gilded room, the crystal chandelier, Vasari's hand on my chin, the heavy footsteps in the hallway. I woke up sitting up in bed with my heart in my throat and a scream dying in my mouth. I stayed like that for maybe a minute, listening to my own breath and the distant ticking of some clock in another room. There was a knock. Quietly. 3 knocks. Spaced out. "Leora." Cassiel's voice came from the other side. "May I come in?" I couldn't speak. I tried. The stone in my throat had come back. "Say yes or no," he asked, even lower. "I'll wait." "Yes," I whispered. The door opened slowly. He came in barefoot, in black trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, with a book in his hand. He didn't turn on any light. He didn't come near the bed. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, about 4 paces away. "I sent someone to your apartment earlier," he said. "Your mother is sleeping peacefully." They asked her for 3 books that looked the most worn, with the kind of care that comes from understanding what they meant. "One of them is here, on your nightstand. I can read out loud. You don't need to open your eyes." I looked to the side. On the little table was a battered volume I recognized before I could think. One of my father's books, the kind I used to read with him, leaning against his shoulder on the afternoons he came home early from the docks. It had disappeared the night of the kidnapping, along with so many other things. Cassiel had sent someone to find it. "You can," I said. He opened to some page and started reading. His low voice, unhurried, without performance, drifted down through the dark of the room like a patient hand. I lay down on my side, facing the wall. I closed my eyes. The words of my father, in the mouth of another man, stitched something inside me that had been open for far longer than I had admitted. I fell asleep in some passage I didn't remember. I dreamed of the sea. I woke up alone. The book was closed on the little table, with a strange feather marking the page where he had stopped. The chair on the floor was untouched. He hadn't slept there, but he hadn't disappeared too early to pretend it hadn't happened either. New coffee on the tray, warm bread, another note. "The library is at the end of the east corridor. I'll be in the study all morning." It took me until the end of the afternoon to come down. The library was a room with a high ceiling, with windows that ran from floor to ceiling and a wooden ladder leaning against one of the walls. The smell was old paper and wax, and there was a hint of sweet smoke, as if someone had lit a fireplace there hours earlier. I ran my fingers down the spines like someone greeting old acquaintances. I didn't hear him come in. I only noticed when the air changed. It became denser, the way the air does when someone walks into a room and fills it completely without having to do anything. "Find one." I turned. Cassiel was leaning against the doorframe, with his hands behind his back, the dark onyx ring against the wood. "This one?" I said, holding the volume against my chest. "Dion, it was my father's too." "I know." I looked at him. He came toward me slowly, and every step he took on the carpet was muffled, calculated, as if he were measuring how much closeness I could tolerate. He stopped at a distance I hadn't learned to call close, but that hurt as if it were. He lifted his hand, and, only with the tips of his fingers, only for a second, brushed a strand of hair away from my face. The touch was so light I doubted it afterward. Cassiel tilted his head. I tilted mine. His eyes dropped to my mouth and stayed there too long. His breath hit my lip before his mouth did, warm, with a trace of coffee and something darker. More him. I closed my eyes without deciding to close them, and he pulled back, a whole step. His hand fell to his side. I opened my eyes. "Not like this," he said, in the lowest voice I had ever heard from him. "You don't owe me anything, Leora. Not even this." He left. I stood there with my father's book against my chest, listening to his footsteps move away down the hallway. There were tears on my face, and I didn't know since when. It was there, in the middle of that huge, hushed library, with the golden dust glinting against the light coming in sideways through the tall windows, that I understood what was happening. I had walked into that house expecting the worst. I had found a man who stepped back, asked, closed doors from the outside so he could hand me the key. And now I was afraid, but the fear was no longer of him. It was of what I would discover, inside me, if he actually touched me. Chapter 4. Theo on his knees and a safe behind the mirror. The front gate called up late Monday morning. Sandro came up to the sitting room where I was, with an open book in front of me whose lines I hadn't read, and stopped at the doorway with the look of someone who'd rehearsed the sentence in the hall. "Miss," he said, "there's a young man downstairs. Says he's your brother. He's been crying for an hour. The Don asked me to check with you before letting him in." I stood up so fast the book fell to the floor. Sandro picked it up and handed it back without comment. "Let him in," I said. "Miss, he came alone. No weapon, nothing. I've already searched him. But if you'd rather he wait downstairs, the Don will only let him up when you say so. Let him in, Sandro, please." He nodded and went down. I almost ran to Cassiel's study. The door was ajar. I knocked. Cassiel raised his eyes from the desk, saw my face, and unhurriedly closed the folder he was reading. "Theo's here," he said. "I know. You knew he was coming. I had them let him know you were all right. I thought he needed to hear it before he tried something stupid." I had no words. Cassiel stood up and pointed to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down. You decide everything, from here on. If you want to talk to him alone, I'll step out. If you want me to stay, I'll stay in the corner. If you want him gone, he goes." "Stay," I whispered. "Please." He nodded. He went to the window and stood with his back to me, his hands crossed behind him, giving the scene the respect of not occupying all of it. Theo came in, led by Sandro. For a second, I didn't recognize the skinny kid in a dirty sweatshirt, with a swelling eye closing, his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, his hands trembling at his sides. He saw me and dropped to his knees before I could go to him. "Leora," his voice came out shredded. I knelt in front of him. He tried to hug me and couldn't. His hand stopped in the air between us, unable to bring itself to touch me. "I swear," said Theo. "I swear, Leora, I would give you my life right now, here, even now. If I could undo that night, if I could trade places with you, if I could—" "Theo, I knew I owed. I knew it was dangerous people. I thought I'd pay it off. I thought if I bet one more time, I'd cover it. And then they kicked our door in and I just stood there. Leora, I just stood there. I watched them take you and I didn't—" His voice broke. He pressed his forehead to the floor. I put my hand on his hair and stayed like that, listening to him sob against the wood, feeling my whole chest turn into something I couldn't name. I looked at Cassiel. He was still standing with his back to the window, but the line of his shoulders had changed, more rigid, as if he were holding something he didn't want to let drop. "Cassiel," I called quietly. He turned. He crossed the study with that calm stride that was the most dangerous thing about him. He stopped beside us. "Get up," he said to Theo, without harshness, but without softness either. "Sit in the chair." Theo got up, shaking. He sat down. He wiped his face on his sleeve and kept looking at the carpet, unable to bring his eyes up. "The debt," said Cassiel. "How much?" Theo said a number. Cassiel didn't blink. "It's paid." Theo lifted his eyes for the first time. "How?" "The debt is paid. I'll buy the note from the middleman loan shark this afternoon. Vasari will never see that money. You don't owe anyone in Chicago anymore. Not Vasari, not his dogs. Is that clear?" "Sir, I have no way to pay you back. You won't pay me back in money. You'll pay me back in work. There's a simple security job in this house. Fixed shift, fixed salary, uniform. You'll live in the annex. You'll answer to Sandro. You'll learn not to gamble even when no one's watching. If you slip once, I don't send anyone to bring you back. Understood?" Theo nodded his head so hard I thought he'd hurt himself. Understood, sir. You prove repentance with work, Cassiel said. Not with crying. Crying runs out. Work doesn't. Sandro appeared in the doorway as if he had been called by telepathy. He had a dark uniform folded over his arm. Come with me, he said to Theo. Dawn, if he falls asleep on the first shift, I'm not bringing him back. Deal, Cassiel answered, without smiling. Theo stood up. Before leaving, he turned to me. I stood up. He pressed his forehead lightly to mine, the way our father used to do, and walked out without saying anything else. I heard his footsteps cross the stone hallway to the side door, and I heard the door open and close, and only then did I breathe. Cassiel squeezed my hand a little tighter, without saying anything, because sometimes he knew exactly when his silence was more useful than any of his words. We were quiet for a while, drinking the coffee that was too weak and too hot at the same time, and that morning, weak and hot was the most beautiful thing I had ever drunk. I looked out the window. The lake out there had given up on being metal and was starting to be water again, with a few small ripples slapping against the stone of the pier and a single fishing boat passing very far away, deep in the landscape, in no rush to get anywhere. Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. I went up to him. I slowly raised my hand and rested it on his cheek. His beard had started to come in, rough against my palm. It was the first time I had touched him without trembling. He closed his eyes. His chin gave way a millimeter against my hand, the way someone takes a punch they hadn't expected, and that, for some reason, felt good to take. Thank you, I said. No, he whispered, with his eyes still closed. Not for this. I drew my hand back. Slowly, he opened his eyes. You need to eat, said Cassiel. Sandro is waiting for you in the kitchen. You don't eat. He hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but I saw it. I'll eat, he said. If you stay. I stayed. The kitchen was a big room of white tile and a long wooden table. Sandro was leaning on the counter with a cup, and an older man with graying hair, gray suit, thin-framed glasses, was sitting at the table complaining about the bread. Maurice, Cassiel introduced. Consigliere of the house. Complains about everything. You get used to it. I don't complain about everything, said Maurice, without lifting his eyes from his plate. I complain about the bread, the weather, Sandro, and the dawn. In descending order of seriousness, Cassiel raised an eyebrow over his cup. Maurice, without changing his tone, continued. What we discussed last week is ready, Dawn. You know the piece and the timing. When you say so, I move. Dawn at the end? Sandro observed. Dawn at the end because he's the only one beyond repair. I laughed. Sandro choked on his coffee. Cassiel looked at me the way someone looks out the window and sees the sun for the first time that day. Miss, said Maurice, finally lifting his eyes. Sit, eat. If you survive that room, you'll survive this bread. It's less dangerous, but only barely. I sat. Sandro told, and in his usual dry voice, a story about Maurice pretending to have a backache so he wouldn't have to climb the stairs to the Dawn's study. Maurice defended himself with the offended dignity of a judge. I laughed again. Cassiel didn't say much. He only sat next to me, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his arm without him touching me, and watched me laugh like someone recording something important. When everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed in the kitchen a little longer. Then I walked to the study. I knocked. Cassiel answered without surprise, as if he had been waiting. May I? Come in. He was in a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and a pen in his hand. There were papers spread out on the desk. Small maps. Notes I couldn't read upside down. He closed everything unhurriedly when I sat in the chair across from him. I want to tell you something, I said. He set down the pen. Tell me. When I was there, in the gilded room, I heard things. Voices in the hallways. The men talked thinking we couldn't hear. Pilar taught me to pretend to sleep so I could hear more. I know names. I know days. I know what time the accountant arrived with a green notebook. Cassiel leaned forward. He took a fresh notebook from a drawer. He opened it to a blank page. Tell me everything, he said. Slowly. Everything you remember, even if it seems small. I told him. I told him the roots I had heard through the pipes. The name of the man who opened the buyer's door. The number of thugs in the upper hallway and the lower hallway. The safe behind the mirror in Vasari's office. Pilar had seen it once when she was forced to clean the room. The green notebook. The nights the cargo cars arrived through the back street. Cassiel wrote. His hand was steady, his handwriting tight. Now and then, he stopped and asked me to repeat a detail, never doubting me. When I finished, he rested the pen on the edge of the notebook and was quiet. Leora, he said, low. Do you know what you're giving me? I do, I answered. I'm giving you a chance to get them out of there. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something different inside them, something I couldn't name in the moment, but that I understood later, when I lay down in bed, had been his first visible crack in front of me. He was about to say something when Sandro opened the door without knocking. His face was closed. Dawn, West Perimeter. 2 cars stopped on the lake road at 9. The men got out, measured the distance from the fence, made notes, and left. The boys in the tower made 2 of them by their plates. Vasari. Cassiel didn't move, only his jaw locked. Reinforce everything, he said. Send Theo to the annex now. Double the guard on the house while we move. Already done. One more thing. An envelope arrived at the gate. No return address. Here, sir. Sandro set the envelope on the desk and left. Cassiel opened it. Inside, 3 photographs. I leaned in, and the blood drained from my face. It was my mother, taken from far away, through the window of our apartment. In one, she was taking medicine. In another, she was in bed. In the third, the neighbor was coming in with soup. I grabbed the edge of the desk so I wouldn't fall out of the chair. Cassiel turned the photos face down with a sharp gesture. He took my hand across the desk for the first time in 4 days, without asking. It might have been the only time he didn't ask. She's protected, he said, looking into my eyes. I had 2 men on the floor as soon as you told me about her. The neighbor knows. Your mother doesn't need to know. Nobody is going to touch her. Are you listening to me? I nodded. The tears fell. He didn't wipe them. He waited for me to breathe. I'm moving it up, said Cassiel. I was going to wait another week. We can't. Tomorrow night, we go into the Voluto Nero. Me, Sandro, 10 men. Maurice stays here with you. The safe house is ready. I squeezed his hand. I stayed like that for a length of time I couldn't measure, listening to my own breath fall in step with his. When my breath came back into my body, I heard my voice before I decided to speak. I'm going with you. He let out a breath through his teeth that was almost a laugh, and wasn't. Leora, there are voices in there that only I'll recognize, I said. Pilar, Inez, Marisco. They're going to hide them. Lock them behind doors that look like closets. If you go without me, you're going to kick down the wrong door and they're going to die while you find the next one. You know I'm right. Cassiel didn't answer for a long time. He looked at my hands on the desk, then at my face. He found something there that made him give in, and made him hate himself for giving in at the same time. You stay behind me the entire night, he said, low. Vest. Sandro at your side, and when I tell you to get down, you get down before the D is out of my mouth. I will, I whispered. He brought my hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to my fingers. It wasn't a kiss. It was a promise. I left the study with a light head and heavy feet. I climbed the staircase slowly. From the hallway window, I saw the light in his study still on. I also saw, down at the gate, Sandro walking around Theo, who was in his new uniform, with his face swollen from crying, and his shoulders straighter than I had seen them in years. Tomorrow night, I would be going back to the Voluto Nero, this time through the door no one was expecting, and with the hand of a man who had paid millions not to touch me, and I wasn't afraid. Chapter 5, The Night of the Voluto Nero. The next night, before we left, the study smelled of paper and fresh ink when I walked in. Cassiel was bent over a floor plan of the club, spread end to end across the mahogany desk, the onyx ring scraping slowly against the dark wood in a rhythm that sounded like someone counting another person's heartbeat. The green-shaded lamp poured low light over the drawing, and the dust floated in the beam as if it too were waiting for the order to move. Maurice, beside him, traced with his finger a corridor I recognized before he even named it. It's through there, I said quietly, from the doorway. The kitchen has a steel door that opens onto a service corridor. Pilar said no one watches that door because the thugs think it's just a staff passage, and the cook slips out there to smoke between one order and the next. Cassiel raised his eyes. I had walked in barefoot on the carpet, and he only noticed now. He didn't say anything for a long second, one of those where his silence weighs more than any words, and I felt heat climb up my neck as if he had pressed a finger there. Morik cleared his throat softly, the way someone reminds the room he exists. Miss, sit down, the consigliere asked, sliding a leather chair over with his foot. You're going to have to explain this 3 times before I'll believe a girl who sells clothes memorized the layout of a nightclub in 2 nights. I didn't memorize it, I answered, sitting with one knee pressed against the other, smoothing the fabric of the dress over my thigh because my hands needed a job. I just paid attention. Pilar repeated everything 4 times. She said that if we ever got out, somebody needed to know how, because a frightened woman's memory was the most stubborn thing there was. Cassiel looked away, back at the plan, but I saw his jaw lock. It was his gesture for swallowing something that didn't fit out loud, and I had already learned to recognize that tiny crack. Sandro came in at that moment with a black vest folded over his arm, stopped beside my chair, and laid the fabric on the desk without ceremony, kicking up a small cloud of dust that danced against the lamp. "For the miss," he said. "Dawn, before you ask me to argue, she's braver than you are." "I know," Cassiel answered, without looking up. Sandro gave half a smile and left, closing the door with the care of someone who doesn't want to crack the silence. Morik pretended not to listen, folding a corner of the plan with his thumbnail. Cassiel finally faced me, and there was something new there. Not retreat, not haste, just a visible struggle not to tell me to stay. "Leora," he began slowly. "If you come, you walk behind me, always. You don't see their faces, you only listen. If I tell you to get down, you get down before the verb is finished. If I tell you to leave, you leave through the door you came in by and Sandro gets you out, even if he has to carry you." "All right." "It's not all right," he said, his voice even lower, almost hoarse. "It's the only thing I'm going to ask of you since you got into this house. I need you to promise me, out loud, looking at me." I rested my hand on my own leg, so I wouldn't tremble, and breathed through my nose the way Pilar had taught me. I lifted my chin the way she had shown me that first night, and answered without making a lake of it this time. "I promise." He closed his eyes for half a second. It was almost a thank you. The armored car pulled out of the mansion when the sky was already black, and the lights at the docks were blinking in the distance like a tired animal. Sandro was driving. Cassiel was beside me, and I was holding the vest over my coat with both hands, feeling the strange weight of Kevlar against my ribs, a weight that seemed to want to remind me I was too small for what was coming. Lake Michigan appeared between the warehouses in pieces, dark as spilled ink, and the smell of the cold water mixed with the leather of the seat and the discreet cologne off him. We stopped 3 blocks from the Voluto Nero. Morik had sent 2 men ahead to clear the path to the kitchen service door, and there were radios murmuring low inside the car, a dry voice calling out positions with the indifference of someone reading the weather forecast. Cassiel turned to me in the seat, and this time his hand touched, just a thumb on my wrist, on the inside, where the skin is thinner, and the pulse gives itself up without permission. "Breathe," he asked. I breathed. He kept that second in his expression, like someone tucking money into the lining of his jacket, and opened the door. The cold air from the street hit my face and made me blink. The side entrance was exactly the way Pilar had drawn on the floor of the gilded room with a wet finger. A narrow corridor of grimy white tile, the smell of cold grease stuck to the walls, a steel door that creaked if you pushed it in a hurry. Sandro pushed it without hurry. The first guard went down before he could turn his head. The second took a pistol-butt smack I didn't see, only heard, the sound of something hollow hitting something full, and the muffled thud of a body on the concrete floor. "Behind me," Cassiel whispered. I walked behind him, counting steps so I wouldn't think of anything else. The old gold corridor began after a double door, and the smell changed from grease to expensive perfume mixed with cigar smoke and spilled liquor. Shots cracked somewhere ahead, 3, 4, then silence. The smoke rose in layers until it hit the dirty crystal chandelier and came back down through the cracks in the ceiling, forming a yellow haze that stung the eyes. I rested my hand on the wall to steady myself, and felt the worn velvet under my fingers, the same velvet Inez had clutched with her nails while she cried. "Here," I said, stopping in front of the third door on the right. "It's her voice. She's crying." Cassiel didn't ask if I was sure. He set his shoulder, turned the knob with his elbow, and the door gave way with a dry crack. Inez was sitting on the floor, curled up against the foot of a vanity with a cracked mirror, and when she saw me, she didn't scream. She only opened her arms like a child who had been waiting for hours. Marisco appeared behind her, barefoot, the hem of her dress stained, and silently pointed to the back wall. There was a false door behind a heavy damask curtain, and behind the door was a smaller, stifling room, with Pilar sitting bolt upright, watching over another girl I didn't know, holding her hand the way someone holds the wrist of a wounded bird. "You came back," said Pilar, hoarse as ever. I knew it. I promised. Sandro came in behind us with 2 more men, gathered the 4 of them up in blankets and jackets that smelled like a new house, and led them out through the same corridor we had come in. Pilar stopped for a second in front of me before she left, and lightly touched the sleeve of my coat with her fingertips. "The man in the black suit," she whispered. "Was he the one who got you out of there?" I looked at Cassiel, 3 steps ahead, checking the clip of his weapon without making a sound, the yellow light hitting the tense line of his jaw. "That's him. Take care of him," she said, and her gaze had that tired tenderness of someone who has cared for many. "Those are the hardest ones to take care of." She left. I stayed. Cassiel looked back, saw I was still there, and made a short gesture with his chin for me to follow. We walked 2 more corridors to the door I recognized again by the smell, varnish and old cigars, and a Swedish note of brandy spilled into ancient carpet. The office with the mirror. Vasari was standing behind the desk when we walked in, the knot of his tie loose, his collar open, his right hand already lifted with a small pistol with a pearl grip. Cassiel raised his unhurriedly. It was one of those scenes where 2 men know that only one of them is walking out the door, and they still choose to talk first, as if words were a final courtesy between wolves. "Renvoy," said Vasari, faking the same stitched smile from the auction hall. "You broke into my house. You sold the daughter of the man who inspected and exposed your ports," Cassiel answered, slowly. "My house is wherever I say it is. I didn't know she was anybody's daughter. I just saw a pretty body in a gilded room. I felt the blood rise and fall in the same beat." Cassiel didn't blink. "You were never the owner. I paid. You only brokered the transaction." Vasari laughed, low, and the laugh hit the mirror behind him and came back cracked. Then his stitched smile tore open at once. The hand with the pistol came up again, decided, and he spat an order in Italian to someone behind a door. A side door opened. I shrank behind Cassiel, and 2 thugs charged in. Cassiel pivoted, pushed my shoulder down with his forearm, and the first shot came from the corner of the room, not from his gun. Sandro had come in through the side door in silence. The thug went down before his second step. The other raised his hands. Vasari spun toward the mirrored wall, his hand stretched out toward the safe, still trying to reach the green notebook. "Burn it. Make everything disappear." Cassiel crossed the room in 3 strides and pinned his wrist against the mirror with a dry snap. "Too late," he said, low. It was at that instant that the 3 plainclothes men came in, with a federal badge flashing on the chest of the first one. Morik had stitched this part together under the table, the "what we discussed at breakfast," finally in motion. I understood everything at once when I saw the safe behind the mirror open wide, the accountant's green notebook in the hand of an agent in gloves, and Vasari still struggling against the wrist held to the mirror. "I wanted to kill you," Cassiel said to him, still in a low voice, lowering the gun with the same care you'd use to disarm a trap. "But I already buried a brother by your hand. I'm not going to bury my piece a second time." We left through the same old gold corridor. The sun was starting to lighten the sky behind the lake when we got back in the car, and I realized then that there was blood from the girl I didn't know on the hem of my dress. Not my blood, hers, from the cut she'd had on her arm when Pilar was holding her. The stain was small, dark, and even so it seemed to take up the whole dress. Cassiel took his handkerchief from the inside pocket of his jacket, white, folded in 4, with initials embroidered in dark thread, smelling of the same discreet cologne off his collar. He took my right hand without asking, and asked, afterward, with his eyes. I let him. He cleaned me finger by finger, slowly, without words, tracing each joint as if he were learning the drawing of my hand by heart. His breath changed. Mine changed with it. Sandro pretended to look at the road with the polite stubbornness of someone who works in a household of important people. When the car came through the gate of the mansion, I said, quietly, without letting go of his hand, "I stayed." "I know," he answered. The porch came into view around the curve of the drive, the wisteria still dark with dew, and the sky already showing the first silver-gray thread above the lake. Cassiel looked at me like someone deciding never to pull back again. Chapter 6. The Dawn and the Question She Didn't Ask. The veranda of the mansion opened straight onto the lake, and the lake at that hour was a smooth sheet of metal. No boat, no bird, just the silver gray hitting the stone. The air had that thin pre-dawn cold that slips up through your sleeves and settles between your shoulders. And on the inside, in the sitting room behind us, I could still hear the old pendulum clock marking a time that no longer felt like mine. Cassiel stopped 2 steps away from me and took off his jacket. It was the same gesture as on the terrace weeks before, with the difference that this time he didn't drape the jacket over my shoulders without speaking. He held it in his hand, looked at my face for a long time, from chin to eyes, from eyes to mouth. from eyes again, and asked, "May I?" I nodded, and my head moved before my will did, as if my body already knew the answer to a question my mouth hadn't yet learned to answer. He set the fabric on my shoulders, and his fingers lingered a second longer than strictly necessary on the skin of my neck, right at the curve that ends near the collarbone. He didn't pull back. Neither did I. I felt the warmth that had been trapped in the lining of the jacket travel down my back, and for a moment, it was as if he were holding me without using his arms. "Leora," he began slowly, leaning his hip against the stone balustrade and crossing his ankles like someone planning to stay until the sentence was done. "Before anything else happens after this dawn, I need to offer you doors, a safe house up north, far from Chicago, with my people watching the perimeter without you ever knowing they're there. A trip to get your mother out of that apartment, and to a decent doctor, everything paid for, with your name nowhere I can reach it. An apartment in Boston in Henna's name. If you'd rather a city where nobody knows you and nobody owes me a favor." "Why?" The question came out steadier than I expected. He turned his face toward me, and the still faint light caught the left side of his jaw, the side with the small scar I'd learned to recognize on the days he sat on the floor of my room to read out loud. "Because you don't owe me anything. You never did. And if you choose to stay with me, I need it to be because you chose it, not because I was the first man who didn't touch you when he could have." I looked at the lake for a second, feeling the weight of his jacket settle on my shoulders like a blanket that had been thought up to my size. The smell was his smell, cold tobacco, and an expensive shaving soap, and underneath everything a dry cedar scent that came from the drawer where he kept his shirts. It was a smell that had become, without my noticing, the smell of sleeping peacefully, the smell of not waking up screaming, the smell of a house where a door slammed and I didn't need to flinch. I thought of my mother, in the narrow bed of the apartment, of the medicine that ran out before payday came. I thought of Theo, on the service staircase, of his face when he knelt on the carpet of this mansion. I thought of myself, the Leora of a few days ago, curled up in a gilded room counting cracks on the ceiling so I wouldn't think about the auction. All of them were inside me, listening for this answer. "Cassiel," I said quietly, and his name came out of my mouth in a new way, with no fear leaning against it. "I don't want the safe door. I want yours." He closed his eyes for an instant. I saw his cheek twitch by just a millimeter, the way something twitches when it had been ready to hear the opposite and didn't. Then he brought his face close to mine, slowly, very slowly, with the care of someone approaching a small animal that might still bolt, and he stopped a hand's width from my mouth. His breath hit my lip before his mouth did. "May I?" "You may." He kissed me like someone learning. His hand came up to the side of my face and stayed there, holding my cheek the way you hold something you still don't believe you have. His thumb moved once, slowly, under my eye. It was long, it was slow, with no hurry at all, and at some point I stopped thinking about breathing, and started breathing from him, from the warm air that was leaving his mouth and entering mine. When he pulled his mouth away by just a centimeter, I realized I was breathing in time with him without having arranged it, and that my hand had risen to his chest without my telling it to, and that his heart under the shirt was beating faster than his face was letting on. I took his hand. I pulled it slowly. He came without hesitating, without asking again, but with his eyes asking me to confirm with every step. We crossed the sitting room in silence. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my bare feet, and his jacket stayed on my shoulders until the foot of the staircase, where it fell across the arm of a chair because his hand had found my waist. We climbed the staircase one step at a time, unhurried, and the door of his room closed behind us with the soft click of a lock that had never been forced. The whole house went luminous with silence. Morning came late. I woke up first, with the sun already inside the room, gilding the white sheet and casting leaf shapes on the floor because of the tree in the garden. I lay there for a minute just looking at the high ceiling, counting beams this time instead of cracks, and noticing that fear had left me at some point during the night and hadn't yet come back looking for the door. I used his shirt to go downstairs, a white shirt that fell to the middle of my thigh and smelled of the same jacket from the veranda. I went down barefoot. The banister was cool against my palm. The kitchen was empty, sun coming through the stained glass and breaking into colored squares on the stone floor, and Cassiel was already there, with his back to me, fighting with the coffee maker. He was wearing a gray shirt half open at the collar, and his hair was rumpled in a way I had never seen, as if he too had gotten up and come down without stopping at a mirror. "I don't know how to use this," he said, without turning, but I knew he had heard my footsteps. "I have never, in my entire life, used this coffee maker. Does Morik make it? Always." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed without holding anything back on the inside, without first checking whether it was safe, without measuring the size of the sound. Cassiel turned toward the sound, slowly, and his expression was that of someone hearing something he had been waiting for far too long. He braced both hands on the counter, lowered his head for a moment, and took a deep breath, as if the laugh had bumped into something inside him. "Do that again," he asked in a low voice. "What?" "Laugh like that." I sat on the marble counter, and the stone was cold under my thigh because of the short shirt. He learned to use the coffee maker by trying 3 wrong buttons and 1 right one. With a look of concentration on his face I had never seen on a man who gave orders to other armed men without ever having to raise his voice. He filled 2 cups, set one in front of me, and instead of sitting on the other side, sat down beside me, pressed against me, his thigh touching mine, and his hand resting on top of mine on the marble. His fingers traced a small loop on the back of my hand before settling. "Too strong," he assessed, after a sip. "Too weak," I said. At the same moment, we looked at each other. He let out a laugh through his nose. Both. Morik walked through the door with a newspaper under his arm, stopped, looked at the 2 of us, at the oversized shirt, at the joined hands, at the 2 humiliating cups on the marble, and sighed loudly, with the kind of sigh he saved for long meetings. "This kitchen is unbearably romantic before 9, he complained, without greeting anyone, folding the paper under his arm harder than necessary. "I'll have my coffee in the garden, like a civilized man, and when I come back, I expect at least one of you to be dressed for a meeting." "You heard the man," Cassiel commented, straight-faced, after the door closed. "Civilized. You're the Don. And he's Morik." Cassiel pressed his forehead to the side of my head and laughed. A short, low laugh, his own. The kind I had already learned to recognize because they were rare and they were only for me. Theo came in a few minutes later, in his new security uniform, awkward with pants that still had too sharp a crease and his badge hanging crookedly on his chest. He stopped in the doorway, and for a second, I saw the boy he had been at 12, before my father died, before the gambling, before the gilded room. He looked at my oversized shirt, looked at Cassiel's hand on mine, and greeted the Don with a respectful nod. The kind you learn by watching, not by being taught. He greeted me with his eyes, and his eyes were wet without crying. "All good?" I asked. "All good," he answered, quietly, straightening the badge with 2 fingers. "I'm heading out to cover the gate. Sandro gave me the morning shift. Said if I don't fall asleep at my post in the first week, maybe he'll let me stay. You'll stay?" "I'll try." "Theo." "Yeah? Thank you for staying." He looked away at the floor for a second, bit the corner of his mouth the way he had as a kid, nodded, and left. I heard his footsteps cross the stone hallway to the side door, and I heard the door open and shut, and only then did I breathe. Cassiel squeezed my hand a little tighter, without saying anything, because sometimes he knew exactly when his silence was more useful than any words. We were quiet for a while, drinking the coffee that was too weak and too hot at the same time. And weak and hot was, that morning, the most beautiful thing I had ever drunk. I looked out the window. The lake outside had given up on being metal, and was starting to be water again, with a few small ripples slapping the stone of the dock and a single fishing boat passing very far away, deep in the landscape, in no hurry to get anywhere. And then the thought came, so fast it almost wasn't a thought, just a shadow crossing the glass. Why him, that night, exactly. It passed. I wanted the cup in front of me. I wanted his hand on top of mine. I wanted the oversized shirt on my body and the smell of cedar at the collar. Cassiel pressed his forehead to my temple at that exact moment. He didn't see the thought. He couldn't have seen it, but he pressed his forehead there, as if something inside him had picked up on a small wind in my breath. His day-old stubble rasped lightly against my skin, and the scent of the jacket came back. Cold tobacco, shaving soap, cedar, and now also the weak coffee we were sharing. His hand squeezed mine again, slowly, 3 times, as if he were saying a word in a code that only the 2 of us knew. I closed my eyes, smiled, and pushed the question away on my own. I decided to trust him. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I ran from the mansion of the man I loved after I discovered documents that turned every gesture of his into manipulation. 5 days later, I got into the wrong car. I thought it was Cassiel Renvoy coming to bring me to safety. It wasn't. I spent 5 nights locked in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere, shivering with cold, eating whatever I could steal, and rereading the documents that turned Lucien de Vera into the monster who might have destroyed my father. Every memory of him, his hand on my waist, his scent on my skin, the way he looked at me while I came undone in his arms on our night, now tasted like sweet poison. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was being disgusted with myself for still wanting to run back to him, for still soaking my pillow, imagining the warmth of his body, even knowing he might have been responsible for the ruin of my family. But fate didn't give me time to choose, because now there was another predator on my trail, a man who had never accepted losing what he wanted. And I was trapped in the worst choice of my life. Go back to the man who might have broken my trust, and who maybe wanted me exactly this way, alone and vulnerable, because only that way did I have any worth to him, perfectly positioned to be broken, or keep running until I understood that far from him, I was exactly where the other man wanted to find me too.